Welcome to the South Asia Democratic Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tapushkanti Ball. In this episode, we dive into a growing battleground, the fight between big tech giants and governments across South Asia. As platforms like Meta, Google, and X increasingly shape public discourse, influence elections, and control vast amounts of user data, governments are scrambling to regulate their power, often with mixed motives and uneven success. From India's Broadcasting Services Regulation Bill to Bangladesh's Digital Security Act or Cyber Security Act or Cyber Security Ordinance, the region is witnessing a tug of war between digital freedom and state control, raising urgent questions about privacy, accountability, and democratic resilience. To help us unpack these complex dynamics, we are joined by Professor Subhajit Basu, Professor of Law and Technology at the University of Leeds. Professor Basu is a globally respected scholar in cyber law, digital governance, and AI ethics. With a particular focus on the Global South, he has served as chair of the British and Irish Law Education Technology Association and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. His work has informed policy data debates across Europe, Africa, and Asia, and his publications, including Privacy and Healthcare Data and Global Perspectives on E-commerce Taxation Law, are widely cited in academic and policy circles. Professor Basu, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Barrister Ball, for your kind introduction. It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Recent days, we have seen that social media has played a significant role in the uprising of youths in Bangladesh, then in Nepal, and overall in South Asia. We have seen that a particular generation, especially Gen Z, they are being very much involved with the social media, and the social media are being regulated by big tech. So the first question is that what makes big tech regulation a uniquely urgent issue for South Asian countries today?
Thank you, Barrister Ball, for your question, and it's a very pertinent question. Now, the examples you have given actually shows the urgency for regulating the big techs in South Asia. What we have to understand and accept that big techs are not just running social media platforms, they are running parts of our economy, parts of our daily life, particularly in the global south. This is about power. Platforms like Meta, Google, TikTok, they influence speech, which we have seen during the Nepal uprising and what has been happening in India and Bangladesh. They can influence politics, the political dialogues. Even there is a view that they can influence elections. It's a theory, and it is a theory which has been very difficult to refute. They kind of controlled the protest culture. They have been controlling the protest culture in Global South, in South Asia, and we have also seen they having influence on protest culture in Global North. Now, if you look at in the Global South, particularly in South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, the region has got nearly 2 billion people. And a lot of these 2 billion people have got access to social media. So whoever controls those platforms has enormous influence over what people see, what people say, what people believe, and how things are organized. So the problem, first of all, it's not a theoretical problem. We are not panicking. We are not people who are paranoid. We have seen how social media behaves, affects communal tension. We have discussed about misinformation during elections and the impact of it because of it. We know that harassment are organized through social media. Calls to violence, we have seen it during the recent uprising in Bangladesh and what has been going on. We have seen the similar thing in India a few years ago. And there is cross-border propaganda. So we cannot leave the level of influence the social media has in the hands of technically unaccountable foreign companies. These big techs are foreign companies for us in the global south. The other aspect which I write about is quite a lot actually I write about is about sovereignty, data sovereignty. Now, if you look at these social media companies, this whole information society, it is all about data. Data is the new oil. We always tell this thing,
Right.
sometimes probably a bit lightly, but it's not a light thing. It is about data. This
Absolutely.
this is about access to data, use of data. And a
That's why
lot of this data,
we
um,
nowadays we use the terms like data mining.
exactly, and this is my point. This data involves location data, our relationship data, our financial behavior related data, and nowadays also the social media companies are getting access to biometric information. And all of these, if you just think about, all these data are stored or controlled by companies whose headquarters are outside the region. So from for a governmental perspective, this feels like a loss of control, a loss of jurisdiction. I will come to the other part of it, what is the problem with it. But for the moment, think in this way, this feels like that you are losing control. These companies are governing over, say, 2 billion people, but their real time map of their behavior, their lives, are controlled by companies which are in California. So, regulation is also, we want regulation, but we also want that data is governed here under our law.
Right.
So, whether you want to see it as a legitimate self determination, but you can also say, and this is my other half of the point, that this can lead to a route of surveillance.
Hmm.
Okay. So, what I want to see that regulators in global south and south asian countries, they have to do something about it. And then you have the whole aspect of online abuse, the abuse we have seen, the religious tensions we have seen. On the top of that, we have deep fake related images that are being used to manipulate a majority of the population, to victimize the minorities, which we have seen. We have seen deep fake images being sexualized to victimize women in
Right.
this part of the world. We have seen religious hate speech. My biggest fear in this part of the world is we have often seen this religious hate speech spill into street violence within hours. And the coordinated disinformation networks are, are targeting that.
Hmm.
So this is about, if you do not regulate these big techs, if you do not regulate the social media, the problem is you are playing into the hands of companies which are only driven by profit in their mind. The problem here is if you want to regulate it too aggressively, you would scare off investment, you will scare off innovation. And that is a balance which I have seen been very difficult to, or harder to achieve in South Asia than it has been in places like Brussels, because growth stakes are much higher. I have to say, there is an uncomfortable part in this whole thing. Whenever you talk about regulation, there is an uncomfortable part. Regulation is also about control. The same legal tools that can protect citizens from abuse can also be used to silence journalists, can also be used to suppress opposition voices and activists. So when South Asian governments say, yes, we want to regulate. You mentioned about India's attempt to regulate big tech. We need to regulate big tech. The question is to regulate, yes, but to protect whom and against what? And that is something we need to kind of think about. And this is one side, I would say, yes, it is urgent. It's not a niche tech policy debate. It is also about speech, safety, sovereignty, and the economic future of the region. If we want our governments to regulate big techs too aggressively, then there is a risk that they will scare off the investment and the innovation. And and we cannot ignore the uncomfortable part of regulation, which is the overregulation. And I have
Mhm.
always been extremely against overregulation because overregulation can actually create more problem, because regulation on one side, it is about control. So the legal tools that can protect citizens from abuse,
Mhm.
um, can use those legal tools. We know very well that some of the governments are quite capable of using those legal tools to silence journalists, to silence opposition voices, and to sanction activists. So when a government government in any part of the world, it doesn't have to be specifically, it's not a specific problem for the global south or South Asian governments that we want to regulate big tech. The question is always regulate to protect whom and regulate to protect against what. We know civil society groups are often shut out of policy making. Um, in global south is a big problem. They rarely get any say in policy making or law making, which is not the case in the global north, as you know. They are There are a lot of times they are targeted under cybercrime laws. There are a lot of times they are targeted under national security laws. And you would always see global north funds only for those issues that align with their own priorities. So technically, they do not really look after the interests of the citizens, the common man. And platforms, meaningfully, they rarely consult with the people, or people who are vulnerable, or people who are most at risk, um, like women, like activists, like a journalist, or even LGBTQ users, or ethnic or religious minorities. So to go back to your question, yes, there is a very much a need for regulating big techs. Okay, and it is a critical issue for South Asian countries today. I completely accept it. It should be at the center of any policy debate and regulatory debate. But we also have to be very careful that regulation should not have an overreach. It should be about maintaining freedom of speech and expression, safety of people, sovereignty of the countries, and economic future of the region.
The next question that I actually wanted to ask is about the key regulatory gaps that we have in these countries. But after hearing your discussion, I want you to answer first that where we, the people, stand between this tag of war between the government and the big techs. Because government is all about control and big techs are all about money. So, where are we? I need to
Uh,
ask that question first before going into this gap regulation.
um, so we are in the most vulnerable position in this. Okay. In one side, the big techs are driving their business model based on profitability. On the other side, the government wants to regulate. They want to regulate what is in their political interest. They are not regulating always thinking what is good for the people, what is good for the users. A lot of time they're doing it to ensure that it is serving their political interest or the agenda they have for the purpose of protection. So we are at the most vulnerable position in between these two, and it gets worse if if we fall in the minority categories in any of these countries, because
Marginalized category even.
marginalized categories, because nobody looks after our interest or their interest. Because they have, because these people do not have the say, they do not have the critical mass necessary for the big techs to protect from their business interest point of view. Okay. And on the other hand, from the government's point of view, they are not of value because they are the marginalized groups. So protecting their interest does not serve their political interground. Okay, it does not serve their kind of vote bank politics that happens in this part of the world. So it is a concern, and we are the most vulnerable here in between.
The way you put it sounds like that I, as an user, I am a ping pong ball. And at one side there is government, and the other side the big techs, and they're just playing table tennis with me, and that sounds like that. So let's coming back to the question that what are the key regulatory gaps in the South Asian countries, and how we can put ourselves as users in between.
Okay, I want to answer this question through two examples, if I may. Okay, so in one side you have seen there are regulations, that are going to be happening. I know Bangladesh, the current interim government, is thinking about bringing in new data protection law. It's the ordinance, the form of an ordinance. It is thinking about doing it. There are other online safety laws that have been enacted in Bangladesh. There are Online Safety Act. So on information technology regulations that have been enacted in India in 2000. It's quite an old law. But what are the main areas of concern? As I said at the very beginning, data is the biggest concern. And for that purpose, we can look at two examples. And then the examples I always give is GDPR, European Framework for Protecting Data. So protecting data is one gap that is necessary and important. And another one is the UK government's flagship Online Safety Act. Now, there are lessons we can learn from there. Okay, but always we have to remember that these are double-edged swords. Now, if you look at, say, for example, GDPR, okay, now GDPR, what it mandates, what it does, it forces companies which are operating within Europe or targeted towards a European customer, they have to justify why they are collecting data, how they will be using data, for how long they will keep it, and who will get to share it. Okay. It builds on rights of the individual, access, collection, deletion. Also, what it does, it creates an independent data protection regulator. And this is very important, independent data protection regulator to enforce those rights. And also ensure there are serious fines if companies ignore them. Interesting point to note here, India has enacted a data protection law. The question around independence of the data protection regulator arises. So what is important to remember? Yes, the South Asian countries and the governments in the region are pushing for data localization, and I mentioned data sovereignty. But why are they doing it? The gap is there. Is it for the purpose of providing privacy guarantees to its citizens? Is that the purpose? Or is it about ensuring that through this law, the government wants to have a control? If you look at GDPR style approach, it says states can access data, but it is not automatic. You cannot just say, right, I need access to the data because of national security. Because national security, as good as the word is, in one way, it is also a very, very vague terminology and a very over-embracing terminology. It can cover anything and everything if you want to define it in a very, very broad manner.
Absolutely right.
Another point here is we want the government still to show us the legality, the necessity. Why do you need it? Proportionality and oversight. That core idea that state is not above privacy regime. It is something very, very important worth remembering and worth importing. Now, I have a warning here. If you look at GDPR, it sits on the top of a fairly mature rule of law environment. In the Europe, and if we just skip to Europe, we have seen independent regulators working for a very, very long time. Do we have that assurance? Do we have that trust? Yes, South Asian countries and governments can borrow the rights language and accountability mechanism, but what about trust? What about ensuring independence to that regulator? So if you do not focus on that, that gap will remain. Yes, you have a law. You have enacted a law which is very similar to the European Union law. Some would say it's a gold standard law. But is it the law to protect people, or is it surveillance vocabulary wrapped in European rights?
Hmm.
And
I
if you look at UK's Online Safety Act, you have the same issues.
Right. What I wanted to just say that there is a Bengali proverb that says that শিয়ালের কাছে মুরগি জিম্মা রাখা, right? Like that the situation is the gap will remain if the state does not change its character of a fox, of a sly fox, who whatever it says, it will have a back door to interfere with our personal data, and it will use it for its own purpose.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you.
So the gaps are actually in the intentions. So if the intentions and the knowledge that they will abuse it, as long as it is there, it is very much tough to to actually engage the government to protect us against these big techs. And that is why the big techs are taking advantage, I would say, because they know that we don't trust the government. And now we are at a situation when our rights are at risk. There is no one who we can finger at for accountability's purpose. So that brings us about the algorithmic biases, right? That is another phenomena. That then how do algorithmic biases and disinformation campaigns are affecting minority communities? And again, if we are talking about digital authoritarianism under the guise of regulations, whether that is a risk. If you can add as well that how we can make these big techs accountable and responsible for this abuse of trust.
Okay. First, I will start by saying algorithmic biases, right? Is a very important thing. Now, we have to remember our society suffers from biasness. It is intrinsic part of who we are. What is going to be made worse is when that biasness creeps into algorithms. And the impact is devastating. We have seen during previous US elections of creation of echo chambers. Okay. And that is a big problem. So when the algorithm only shows us what we believe in, rightly or wrongly, then it influences our decision-making process. And we are moving towards AI-driven society where AI will control a lot of what we see, a lot of what we hear, a lot of what we think. We will be profiled, we will be silenced also. So the big text algorithms will not only cultivate biasness, but will also reinforce biasness. And that is where the problem is. And that is where the problem lies. Now, your questions about digital authoritism or digital authoritism in fragile democracy, I agree with you. The danger is not theoretical danger. In fragile democracies, strong, if you think about creating strong tech regulation, it can quietly become the very tool of oppression. You have to think of in this way, social media and companies, the companies which have created social media, they have given voice, a platform to people who never had that voice or could not approach. And this is what I said, the double-edged sword I mentioned. If you have a legal framework which is vague and broad, then that legal framework, that vague power becomes the tool of censorship. If a government can order platforms to take down anything that threatens, again, national security, public order, and the worst one here, which is really scares me, which we have seen happening in India quite a few often, morality. How do you define morality? Whose morality are we talking about?
Absolutely. It's such a flimsy term.
Such a thin reserve. And those terms are not defined in our constitutions. They are not always reviewed by independent courts.
Even
So
they
what
are not defined in law.
exactly, they're not defined in law. We have the words, but what do they mean actually? So if I criticize a government, and if the government thinks, well, that is a destabilizing content, and they say Facebook or Meta or Google, you have to take it down, and they take it down, that means you have censorship on demand.
Absolutely.
And what you have worse, you have censorship on demand, which is wrapped in legal language.
Right.
And you can always go back to the law, say like, well, the law mandates it, the law asks for it, so this is why we have asked for this.
Mm-hmm.
So platforms becomes an extension of this authoritarian regime,
Right.
an enforcement arm of this authoritarian regime.
Mhm.
Why would they do it? Because it is in their interest, is in their business interest to do it.
Mhm.
You want your company to get banned or sanctioned in a
More
region.
importantly, you don't want to lose business.
Exactly. You don't want to lose business. So your easiest way out of this is to comply with the takedown orders of the government. You will not think, is this constitutionally valid speech? Is this constitutionally valid content? What you would do is you would create, in the worst case scenario, to go back to your the first question about algorithmic biasness, you can create an algorithm which kind of promotes censorship.
Mm-hmm.
We have an example of it. We know in China, you type anything to do with democracy, automatically it gets censored
Mm-hmm.
through the technology.
Right.
The result is the state doesn't even need to block the content itself. They're
The algorithm is
they're
enough.
exactly, the code is enough. Okay, so yeah,
Mhm.
so that acts on its behalf. Okay, and that is something to think about. Even if you think about online safety, this can be weaponized.
Absolutely.
Everybody, gendered abuse is wrong, deepfake
E-
blackmail
e-
is wrong.
even uh, even my experience, I have seen that the speed of internet can be weaponized.
100%. Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Because by the time somebody reacts, it has reached 100,000 people.
Hmm.
And that then you have and can you really think about a region like ours, in the global
Yeah,
south?
absolutely.
Sure. Even 2% people, if it reaches to 2% people, that is a big number we are talking
Uh,
about.
yeah, and if you delay in reacting because of internet lagging, the effect is devastating.
Absolutely devastating. You just think,
Right.
think about something. A journalist reporting corruption. Yes, the government can turn around and say, that is harmful content. You can say opposition figure calling for protest. The government say, well, that is incitement to violence.
Hmm.
So this big takes can be the perfect tool for oppression in fragile
Absolutely.
democracy.
And
Absolutely.
they can be a tool of anarchy if they all on a sudden declare that we don't want to be authorized by the government. We are our own governments, just like Louis the 14th.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
before ask you the concluding question, like few days ago, Facebook owner and creator Zuckerberg was saying that Facebook doesn't is not regulated by any other country's laws. It has its own laws, so we're not going to bend against any other law. So this is very dangerous.
Can you imagine? Can you
Hmm.
imagine a private company, which is basically a US company,
Hmm.
saying that we are not going to obey by the laws of the sovereign states? And then you have can you just so you have these companies with so much of power, with no responsibility, no accountability, no transparency.
Absolutely right. So, last bit. First of all, do you think that if civil society and academia can play a role in shaping this argument, and what kind of future do we have of digital governance in South Asia? That's the last points.
So I always say that when you are regulating public sphere, okay, whether it's a public sphere in the physical world or is a public sphere in the digital world, you have to regulate within you have to do the regulation in conversation with the public. You cannot end up regulating the public sphere with no public in that room, because that is the hallmark of authoritarian governments. That is the
Right.
hallmark of digital authoritarianism. So the role of civil society, which you know in lawmaking process, in most of the European countries, the lawmaking process involves public. You have green paper, you have white paper, you have consultations, civil societies, NGOs, common man, academic response. I'm very recently I've been responding to a public consultation on Online Safety Act. So Ofcom is now
Mhm.
writing down the rules that the companies will have to comply with. And the last one was about protecting vulnerable individuals. So there is an ongoing dialogue, a process of dialogue, so that
Right.
lawmaking does not become an alien thing,
Mhm.
detached from public, a top-down thing. That is what is missing.
Right.
For example, we have elections. Okay, social media always say you have a patriotic duty to vote. Okay, fight misinformation. On the surface, it looks like public participation, but underneath, if that social media uses algorithm to throttle the opposition voice, then you have a problem. But
Absolutely.
who can rise against these things? The civil society, the academics. We can
Right.
talk about, we can write about this. But the problem, what we face while talking about is writing about is censorship. And the social media is here where the big techs can ensure that the dissenting voices are not throttled. And that
Right.
that that is the most important thing to remember. We have to also look into that, are the takedown powers narrowly defined in law? Can you review the takedown powers? Is there an engagement of the civil society to understand how the takedown powers work? I completely agree. Regulation is essential. Regulation is not the bad thing, but regulation without safeguards is the worst thing in a democracy. And that
Right.
is the biggest concern I have. If there is an independent regulator, does the independent regulator have the technical competence? How is that independent regulator uh, is being created? Is it an arm's length with the government? Is it controlled by a particular ministry?
Whether it is really independent.
Exactly. That is the important thing. Are there explicit protection for lawful political speech, for journalism, for
Mhm.
human rights voting? And if any of this answer to this question is your answer is yes, you have a good regulation. If the answer is no to one of them, you are
Mhm.
actually slowly building censorship into that paperwork. You cannot exclude civil society by design, by purpose, because they are the voice, they are the checks and bounds which will ensure that digital right advocates are upheld. Independent academics, their voice is heard. And that is the most important thing to remember when this happens or regulation of big techs happen.
Thank you very much. It seems that to create a regulation for controlling big giants is like walking on a thin paper.
100%.
So, and we have seen that the moment, for example, both in Bangladesh and Nepal, the moment you stopped access to internet or you have taken down some of the social media, then people are taking to the streets and they are dragging the government down with it.
Yes.
Now, I know that through this podcast we will not get the answer to it. It's not possible. Even I don't know like whether 1,000 hour discussion will be enough to ascertain the depth of it, the depth of the problem, unless we change ourselves. The three parties that we talked about, the government, the user, and the tech giants, all of them have to be reasonable. I don't know what is the definition of the reasonable, but I understand that as a law student, there is a thing called reasonableness of a reasonable person. I will use that standard only. So thank you once again for discussing this timely topic.
Uh, Thank you, Barrister Ball. Just to add one last thing, if I may, please. We always think about regulating technology. That this is about regulating the technology. Unfortunately, this is not always about regulating the technology. It is about regulating behavior. And you got it right. It's about, unless our behavior change, unless
Right.
we are more sensible, things will not change. So it's not just about regulating the technology. It is also regulating the behavior of the people, regulating the content that the people create. And that is the most important thing. The technology is a good thing. Innovation is good,
Yes.
but how you use it, that makes it whether it is a good or bad
Absolutely.
technology.
Absolutely. That's we agree, at least till the end of this podcast. But viewers and listeners, we will definitely discuss on this more in the future podcasts, and I hope Professor Basu will be with us on those discussions. But we had a very interesting discussion, and we invite everyone for our upcoming podcasts. And thank you very much, Professor Basu.
Thank you so much. Thank you.